Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling the genuinely epic transformation of the Indian subcontinent. We're talking about a massive, sweeping story here, going right from the arrival of European fortune seekers through centuries of colonial rule, all the way to a hard-won independence and a truly tragic partition. So let's just jump right in. It's literally one of history's greatest paradoxes. Seriously, think about it for a second. How on earth did a simple joint stock company, the English East India Company, manage to completely dismantle the mighty Mughal Empire and take absolute control over the entirety of India? It definitely wasn't an overnight conquest. No, it was a highly calculated, centuries-long game of chess.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll cover the lore of India, a fractured empire, the British strategy, the rise of the resistance, the final blows, and finally, independence and partition.
Okay, Section 1, the lure of India. Spices, silk, and supremacy. Let's look at what initially drew the eyes of the entire world to India's shores. Back then, India was basically an absolute magnet for European powers. They were drawn by the massive global demand for things like cotton, silk, and spices, leading to this wild scramble for trade supremacy. It all really kicked off with Vasco da Gama's monumental discovery of a new sea route via the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. By the 1600s, you had the Dutch, the British, and eventually the French all showing up and setting up these coastal trading posts they called factories. It became a very crowded, hyper-competitive marketplace pretty fast.
Section 2 of Fractured Empire, the Fall of the Mughals. So, when these European powers arrived looking to expand, what did the political landscape actually look like?
Well, they found an empire that was essentially falling apart. After Emperor Aurangzeb died in 1707, the once unstoppable Mughal Empire began fracturing. Suddenly, regional powers like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad were declaring their own autonomy, and what that did was create a massive political vacuum across the subcontinent. Standing right there, totally ready to exploit this chaos, was the English East India Company, highly disciplined, extremely well-funded, and incredibly organized. Moving to Section 3, the British strategy, the Chanakya Niti framework. Now, this is fascinating because the British seemingly mirrored an ancient Indian strategic playbook to conquer the region. If you look at the ancient text of Chanakya Niti, it outlines 4 pillars of statecraft. And the British? They executed them flawlessly. First up is Sam, or persuasion. They started out by humbly requesting royal charters for trading rights. Then came Dam, bribery. They famously bought off officials like the military commander Mir Jafar right before the Battle of Plassey. When that didn't work, they brought in Dund, brutal military punishment. And finally, Bid, exploiting those regional rivalries we just talked about to divide and rule the local kingdoms. This whole strategy was really cemented by a few incredibly decisive historical events. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey effectively handed the British control of Bengal's vast wealth. Then, the 1761 Third Battle of Panipat completely devastated the Marathas, who were the only real native threat left to stop British expansion. Finally, the Battle of Buxar in 1764 was the absolute nail in the coffin. It granted the company direct revenue collection rights. In that moment, they officially morphed from merchants into actual rulers. Section 4. Rise of the Resistance, the Awakening. Of course, action always creates a reaction, right? This immense British dominance eventually birthed a unified Indian pushback. Over the decades, the resistance drastically evolved. It really sparked with the initial 1857 armed uprising, which deeply rattled the British establishment. But as we jump forward into the 20th century, we see the rise of incredibly organized mass movements led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi. The whole approach shifted toward nationwide non-cooperation, culminating in the definitive Quit India movement of 1942. That movement literally paralyzed huge parts of the country's infrastructure. But we have to remember the freedom struggle was never just operating on one track. Right alongside those peaceful mass movements, armed revolutionaries were operating both inside India and abroad, waging a militant, totally uncompromising struggle. You had groups like the Ghadar Party operating out of the US and Canada, revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, and most notably, Subhash Chandra Bose's massive Indian National Army, fighting alongside the Axis powers during World War II. They kept relentless pressure on the British. Section 5. The Final Blows. The Empire Cracks. By the 1940s, the tide was turning irreversibly against the British Empire, thanks to a mix of intense global and domestic pressures. Take a look at this number, 16,000. Think about that for a second. This massive number represents the scale of just the 1st Division of the Indian National Army. We're talking about Indian prisoners of war who made the choice to take up arms under Subhash Chandra Bose to literally march on India and liberate their homeland by force. It absolutely terrified the British administration.
Ultimately, the British realized the writing was on the wall for a few key reasons. The sheer economic and military exhaustion from World War II left Britain severely weakened. Then, when they attempted to prosecute those INA soldiers for treason, it backfired spectacularly, sparking nationwide fury and uniting Indians across all divides. But the final straw? The 1946 naval mutiny in Bombay. At that point, the British realized they could simply no longer rely on the Indian armed forces to maintain control. The game was effectively up. Section 6, Independence and Partition, a Tragic Dawn. So the crucial point was finally reached. Freedom was at hand, but as we're about to see, it came at an unimaginable human cost. Facing total chaos on the ground and a desperate desire to just exit swiftly, the British government rushed their departure through the Mountbatten Plan in 1947. This plan abruptly, and I mean abruptly, partitioned the subcontinent along religious lines into a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. And here we see the horrifying reality of that rushed exit. 75,000. That is just the recorded estimate of women affected by extreme violence, rapes, and abductions during the sheer chaos of partition. And sadly, the actual unrecorded numbers are widely believed by historians to be much, much higher. The human cost here was just staggering. Arbitrary borders were drawn up by a British official named Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had barely spent any time in India. Those lines triggered one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history. Millions upon millions were displaced from their homes, and the extreme communal violence left behind a legacy of deep, generational trauma. And on top of all that, there was another massive danger lurking: balkanization. By transferring power to suddenly divided provinces and over 500 individual princely states, the British left behind this terrifying risk that the entire subcontinent would just shatter into hundreds of hostile, constantly fighting little nations. It was like a giant puzzle thrown on the floor. This disaster was barely avoided, thanks only to some incredibly rapid, intense political integration efforts in the years immediately following independence.
So all of this leaves us with a really deep question to ponder. How much of today's geopolitical reality in South Asia, the borders we see, the lingering tensions, but also the incredible resilience of these nations, was actually engineered centuries ago by a simple trading company? It's a pretty stark reminder that history is never just stuck in the past. It's literally the ground we are walking on today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.